Good evening, everyone. It is 6:07, and so we will begin our meeting tonight. Good evening, welcome everyone for being here tonight. Thank you for coming. We are thrilled to have special guests with us tonight from Ford through Ferguson Group. Your presence marks the continuation of the important work of the Massey Commission. Welcome also to all of those who are joining us online tonight. My name is Joanne Johnson, and tonight I will be performing the duties of presiding co-chair. We will start the meeting with the approval of minutes from our last meeting. Commissioners, you've had the opportunity to review the meeting minutes from our May meeting. Are there any additions or corrections to those minutes?
For the May meeting?
Oh, goodness, no, for our July meeting. Are there any additions or corrections?
I don't know if I saw the meeting minutes for the July meeting. Are we talking about the executive report in here?
Are they not in your manual here?
Is it the executive summary? Is that what we're talking about?
They're not in there.
Okay. Can we
So
wait to approve them?
We will wait, yes,
Yeah.
we will wait. The meeting minutes, we will wait to approve it. Moving on to work group reports. I'll now ask commissioners serving as work group leaders to present a 2-minute verbal report on your most recent meeting. We will start with Sunshine Clemens, Law Enforcement Hiring, Training, Wellness, and Cultural Competency Co-Lead.
Thank you. We met in August, and we spent our August meeting looking over the first draft of our final report and going through all of the recommendations thus far, line by line, and making edits and suggestions to those. Our next work group meeting will be September the 2nd. We will meet at the Lincoln Library downtown in the Carnegie Room North on the first floor at 5:30 p.m. The meeting is open to the public, and we hope you all can join us.
Thank you, Sunshine. Next, we'll hear from Brian, Integrated Mental Health Services and Emergency Response.
Our next meeting our August meeting is August 20th at the City Library. Since the July meeting, we compiled what we are calling the third quarter report. It basically was compilation of all the substantive presentations we had, including the material provided, and total about 110 pages, which will be hopefully being the core and the foundation for the vetting of recommendations for our next meeting. If anybody would like a copy of the third quarter report, happy to share it with anyone.
Thank you, Brian. Next, Kristen Rubalke, Community Education on Public Health and Safety.
The Community Education on Public Health and Safety Work Group met on Saturday, July 26th at 2 p.m. at the CAP 1908 building. During the meeting, we heard from Austin Randolph, president of the Springfield branch of the NAACP. President Randolph brought with him his colleagues, and they discussed the work of the NAACP, including 10 principles, back-to-school stay-in-school program, and the community health care initiatives. Additionally, the work group discussed the July events held in honor of the anniversary of Sonia Massey's death. We also discussed the July Massey Commission presentations and next steps for the work group to create its final report. The next work group meeting will host Chris Mueller, the Executive Director of the Sangamon County 911 Dispatch. This meeting will be held on Monday, August 11th at 5:30 p.m. at the Springfield Public Library. It's not typically held at the public library, but it will be this next time.
September 11th.
Oh,
Yeah.
August 18th, excuse me.
Okay.
Yeah, my bad.
August 18th.
August 18th.
Okay. And lastly, Veronica Espina, Economic Disparities and Service Accessibility.
So we met on the 4th, and we're doing the final drafting of recommendations. We continue to work in these subgroups because we have about 6 areas in which we're drafting recommendations. And unfortunately, we didn't have our presenters that day. We had 2 experts on housing. So I have 2 announcements. We're going to, the group agreed to meet again in August, so thank you for this membership that has been so generous. The work group meeting is going to meet on August 20th at Resource One. It's on a Wednesday at 6 p.m. so we can hear from experts, Karen Davis and Dr. Jackie Newman, on housing segregation. So that's one. That will be our last presenters and experts. And then we are going to have our general Monday meeting for our group, which will be on September 2nd at Resource One, 6 p.m. And like I said, we're just finishing drafting recommendations.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, everyone, for those updates. Before we begin the next part of our agenda, I wanted to ground us all in why the commission exists. We are formed in the wake of Sonia Massey's killing by a former deputy from the Sangamon County Sheriff's Office. We continue to hold Sonia's family and the broader community grieving her loss in our hearts as we work toward justice, accountability, and meaningful change. This evening, we are honored to welcome Forward Through Ferguson, the team that emerged from the Ferguson Commission process in the state of Missouri. Their work has become a national model for how communities can reckon with racial injustice, chart a path toward healing, and build actionable frameworks for systemic change. Forward Through Ferguson will share lessons learned from their work as well as practical insights that may inform the recommendations we are developing here in Sangamon County. Their conversation will guide us this evening, followed by time for questions from the commissioners. Now, before I begin, we initially structured this to be a presentation of sorts by the Forward Through Ferguson team, but just in the beginning of our evening here today, we collectively decided that we think that it would be more beneficial not only for our commissioners, but for everyone involved to have a free-flowing conversation. So they will come forward and we will hear from them, but during that process, if you have questions, if you have things you want to hear from them, how did they do a certain thing, how did it work when they were putting this group together, getting their final report out, we will do that as we go along. We think it'll just be more advantageous that way. Please come up and have a seat right here. It is my privilege to welcome Dr. Nicole Hudson, David Dwight, and Reverend Bethany Johnson-Javois. Thank you for being here with us. There is a longer version of their bios in your binders, commissioners, but I will briefly introduce them for all of us. Dr. Nicole Hudson is a social alchemist who loves solving complex, people-centered challenges. She's worked everywhere from Broadway to city government, including leading the Ferguson Commission's communications, serving as St. Louis's Deputy Mayor of Racial Equity, and now working at Washington University. She also co-produces Broadway-bound shows like The Wiz and Regency Girls. Reverend Bethany Johnson-Javois is president and CEO of Deaconess Foundation and pastor of Monument of Faith Church. She's a longtime advocate for health, racial justice, and equity with over 20 years in nonprofit leadership. She guided the Ferguson Commission's landmark report and is known for inspiring audiences on purpose-driven leadership and systems change. And lastly, Mr. David Dwight IV is a systems change and equity leader with a passion for tackling complex social challenges. He's held multiple leadership roles at Forward Through Ferguson, driving partnerships, dialogue, and action, and got his start with the Ferguson Commission. With a background in bioengineering, he blends strategic thinking with grassroots engagement to create lasting change. We welcome you all. So there's a couple of ways we can do this. If you just have a general intro of sorts, you can start there, and then I will just ask commissioners if you have something that's been not gnawing at you and knowing that you all were going to be our guests tonight, that they can proceed with that as we go.
Okay. I want to say greetings, and it feels appropriate to first acknowledge the first family for what you are continuing to go through for the neighborhood community and for all of you that are here, particularly the heaviness of the weight of responsibility. Just want to start by acknowledging this community. We're not that far off from where you are. I played the role of both Ferguson Commissioner as an applicant who raised my hand among 220 people to want to be on the Ferguson Commission, was selected as a commissioner, and then was asked to change seats, become ex officio commissioner to the managing director, directly responsible for the fullness of the process and the report release.
Good evening. Nicole Hudson. I don't have a doctor in front of it. My sister does, though. I was the communications and community engagement director for the commission process. I came on about 5 months into their process. They'd had a couple meetings before I joined them. And when I got the call to consider whether I would apply to be that consultant, my first response was, I'm not touching that with a 1,000-foot pole. And then I talked to a bunch of people and was convicted that I absolutely was already in this conversation. And I met with Bethany, and Bethany said, I hear that we need you to help us engage people and translate some of the stuff we're doing into stuff that people will want to lean into. And so you can't say no to Bethany. So I did that. And then when the commission sunsetted and there was a question about what would happen next, I like to say I was the last person to put my finger on my nose when we decided to create an organization out of the commission. And so I was the inaugural, what we called lead catalyst, because I refused to be an executive director, of the Forward Through Ferguson organization.
And then a little bit about me. My start in this work was as a student organizer. I'd come back into St. Louis the weekend after Michael Brown was killed and joined with students at a couple universities just wanting to act. We ended up starting an organization that had groups across 8 universities and colleges, all finding ways for students to get activated in the community and also to reflect on how our universities were part of creating racial inequity in the region. And through that, had the chance to interview with these 2 amazing people. So I was the last one in out of the group about halfway through and was a communications and storytelling fellow, but then also the staff liaison for the Civilian Law Enforcement Relations Working Group, helping to form the policy calls to action in that space. I joined on with Nicole as founding staff for Forward Through Ferguson, and then a little bit later became one of the lead catalysts and executive director, and served in that role for 4 years.
Thank you. Okay, commissioners, if you have anything coming up to our final report time, things that you wanted to ask our guests about, how did they implement, how did they structure, those types of things. If there's anything that you would like to ask, now would be the time to do that. I'll acknowledge you, and you can feel free to ask whatever questions you may have. Yeah, Brian, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
I'll end up having a few, but I think it'll be easier to trade off so I'll just start with one. In the implementation, probably, because there's kind of 2 phases to all of this, right? This phase and then the after this phase. So in that implementation or phase, who have been, let's say, the top 2 or 3, and if there are more, so be it, stakeholders for the implementation, would you say, in your area? Or noodle on that for a little bit as...
Is that 2? Yeah.
No, go.
So I guess there are 2 parts of it, one of which we were kind of talking about a little bit earlier, which is that the Ferguson Commission was only created to create a report. That was the original charge. But a lot of the leadership of the commission said, from the beginning, we know that that's not the end point that we're looking towards. We really want to think about sustainability. What does this actually look like in community? How does it translate towards impact? And so they asked the Governor Nixon, who had created the commission, to extend it by 3 or 4 months to create a period of time that was specifically dedicated to thinking about implementation. So that was kind of the first part of the phase, is that it actually kind of there was a middle ground. There were kind of like several phases to it to create more of a blend. And then to the second part of the question, there's not two most important stakeholders. We very quickly realized that, both in creating the recommendations and thinking about what we called the accountable bodies that had some role to play in implementing them. And that role to play could have been, they literally have the decision-making ability and can, by a stroke of the pen, make the change, or they're a key influencer, or they are most impacted groups that need a stake in making the decision. So that's one aspect of it. But then we quickly realized when we were looking at different models across the country of what does it look like for a region or a community to actually implement this kind of like systems level change. And those models really pointed to, it's a set of groups, right? You need to think about what are the kind of nodes that actually have, it's their job to care about it and to think about accountability for it, that are tracking it across time, that are being connectors. There's a role for communications and storytelling. There's a role for continued community engagement. There's a role for funding the work and the ongoing capacities and resources that are needed. So as the model was built for moving forward, it wasn't one or two. It was, okay, what's the ecosystem that supports this work happening into the future, not just for like a year or 2 years?
Something that, when I joked that I didn't want to be an executive director and therefore had a different title, it was partially about the fact that it was unrealistic that any organization could implement that report. So even in the concept of creating an organization, wanting to build into it that it was a catalyst for everybody to come to the table, and not that it was the organization for people to point to and say, what have you done this week? And what we found ourselves leading into was looking at what are the behaviors and attitudes and postures that are most likely to create the conditions that people can work together on these things. So we ended up with sort of the how we did the work and how we understood shared language. So thinking about like what is actually racial equity, how do people operationalize that, how are we describing that or talking about it in a way that people can find their way into it and it isn't just a thing over there, and then how are we asking people, I think we came up with 4 principles: radical collaboration, radical listening, policy focused, and applying the racial equity lens. So it was more about, here's how we can catalyze you to show up and bring your expertise about what it is and your set of responsibilities about what you can do to the table. And if you're operating in these principles and postures, we're more likely as a region to move forward toward that report.
Yeah, I would say that in terms of authorizing environment, there was a kind of push-pull struggle on like who's authorized to implement and who would be the respected people to lead it forward. I would say from my experience that folks or leadership or people or organizations that self-authorize, that said it's the right thing to do and we're gonna do it and we don't have enough money and yet we're gonna get started, actually were the best type of catalyst to have in the process. May not be the formal folks, may not be the ones that you would think. It's the folks who actually move a muscle that they don't have built yet, because it's just that important.
The little follow-up on it is, it sounded like terminology-wise, accountable bodies was one, catalyst was another. So during that—
Calls to action.
What was that?
Calls to action, not recommendations.
Sure, I was thinking though more like specific to whether it was an individual, organization, or group that would be doing, and I think you mentioned some just self-authorized, you know, that stepped up. So like at some point in time, somebody's got to step up and do things. And in that process, I thought you maybe mentioned accountable bodies. So did you, during the phase, identify, bring them in, a mix of both, and is there something you learned that was, if you did it over again, you would have done different?
So I think the accountable body framework came from an information design of like what every call to action was gonna have in it. So the translation that Bethany just offered is that initially, I think the charge says make a set of policy recommendations, and we put that aside and started calling them calls to action. So everything was a call to action. And then we designed, okay, so what do we want to have available for each call to action? We wanted to have we wanted to have a description, sort of the policies that it was connected to. We had a set of things, and one of the things was accountable bodies. And I say it was more of an information design than a strategy, because I think one of the things we learned is that if we had socialized the accountable bodiness part, it could have been a little bit different. So there were some people who were named as accountable bodies because they were funders in the region and it needed money to happen, not because we'd sat down and said, this is something we see in your purview, and what do you think about that? We just kind of listed the people who fund in the region. And it wasn't always the same set of rules that put somebody in an accountable body slot, because it could have been a different type of call to action that was legislative, or it was, it depended. So that's how we used it, I think, in hindsight, or soon after the report, because we had so many people saying, I'm in this report, but I didn't know I would be in this report. And we were like, welcome, because we all own this. And it could have been politically more advantageous to do it differently, but we just didn't have time.
That's fair.
Yeah, just to follow up on that too. So David, you said there's an ecosystem that supports the work. And then Brian's questions, related to, could you give a more specific definition of that, and specifically address where there's segments of the community that are not part of the ecosystem, or were not enthusiastic about the report and the work moving forward?
Yeah, I think in the design of it, it kind of goes to what Nicole was saying. We were like, what are the elements that need to happen for something to go from call to action idea to whether it's in law or a decision by an institution or whatever it might be, and then pass that to implementation. And so we thought about what are those capacities that might be needed, and then it was literally what is the institution that needs to make that change. But then it was also, I'm thinking of actually a specific diagram that mapped it out, but then it was what are the community stakeholders that need to be involved? Because the truth is, there's going to have to be pressure and tension often to make changes that haven't previously happened, but maybe should have happened. And so it was not just who are the people that might need to be around the table to talk about it, but also who are the people that need to activate and advocate and raise voice continuously to align these other things to happen. So I know that was very broad, but I'm trying to think of a specific example of what that might be. One example is we were just talking, had a one-on-one conversation before about the Keep Kids in Class initiative. There were a set of recommendations that were about out-of-school suspensions for kids pre-K through third grade in St. Louis school districts, where Black kids were suspended 12, 30, 40 times as much as white kids, which meant a huge amount of learning loss and all of these other things. And there were a set of accountable bodies in there. Soon after the commission sunsetted and the organization existed, a couple of the school districts had been like, hey, we did an analysis, we saw our names were listed. Here's what we presented at our board meeting. They sent that back to us, had us, I think, come and present or talk to them about it. At the same time, a set of grassroots organizations that also worked on this had been activated to say, hey, this aligns with your agendas and what you want. Should this be a priority in your next year to advocate for this? And then a kind of a coalition formed. There was education of policymakers that then needed to make that. There was education of school districts then who were brought to a table, and then several funders across the region said, okay, we're going to invest some dollars into organizations doing advocacy around this in the next year. Or Dwight Ferguson was actually funded to do a data report to say, hey, here's what the research says nationally and locally on this. And all of that meant that then a year later, there was a big public meeting where we're a very fragmented region, all of the 30 superintendents had to come to one big auditorium at one of the school districts, were pre-organized to have made commitments at different levels to change their policies, and that was kind of like the terminating event, where some of the policies changed. So when I mean ecosystem, it's like, okay, funders, organizing, telling the story, data, people who actually, attention, people who actually need to make the change.
And if you had to put a percentage on how much was that your organization pushing and how much was it organic? Like you said, the schools that came forward and said, hey, we saw we were named and this is our report. Like, how much of it were you were like kind of, hey, or how much was it we'd like to engage?
I mean, my honest answer was going to be maybe like 15%
Yeah.
for Ferguson.
What percent?
15.
Low. Yeah.
Of you guys pushing
Yeah.
or
Yeah,
encouraging?
but, go ahead.
No.
You first.
I was gonna say, one of the things that people wanted to continue about the commission work was that we had unlikely collaborators sitting shoulder to shoulder wrestling with problems. And in order to keep unlikely collaborators at a table wrestling with problems, you don't become the one who's pushing. You become the
Right.
one who's, and there's so much work to do that if you have 3 people who raise their hand, you're like, great, let's find the energy, and then you have to locate all the other different moving pieces to like make that go. So there, I would say that it is more of an art form than a strategy. I think that it would have been great, and there are some civic leaders who look back and say the failure of the commission was that there wasn't, by the governor or some other top-down entity, a pot of money lined up to implement the first 10 things. That's what somebody might tell you about that. Nothing that I have experienced tells me anything other than that nobody's gonna build that top-down structure without some pressure.
Right,
Like, we're just not gonna choose
right.
to work against capitalism in a way that invests what we need to build that infrastructure. So that means that it takes a coalition of the willing, met with some tools and support and reflection back and shine to kind of pull together and ride momentum that you have where the energy shows up, and you've laid out enough things that, you're gonna catch some energy, here and there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that 15 is like a catalytic 15%.
Yeah.
Right.
That
Yeah.
activates other energy points to reach the change.
It makes me think about 100 and Change. So the MacArthur Foundation had a thing called 100 and
Yeah.
Change where they gave 100, right? And so this was a landmark thing. In St. Louis, we decided to apply for it through the lens of the commission report, and we had 70-something nonprofits go in on an application together for this one award.
Wow.
And everybody was like, okay, regardless of whether we get the award, the fact that we all sat down to work on a grant application together on behalf of the city and not fight over it is a big win.
Yeah.
But it's not in the report anywhere. And somebody casually met somebody who was on the review board for that. We didn't get it, but they said that was really impressive. We've never seen a city come together and do that. And that was a lot of our bandwidth as an organization, kind of coordinating and facilitating and setting the table for that to happen. And I don't know that we could count or name what came of that, but we know that different coalitions and
I
people
did
stayed
activate
together.
on that,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, one of the groups was like Workforce, and they actually took some of what happened in that process that didn't get the grant, but they took that into the regional chamber ended up doing advocacy at the state level for one of the changes based off of the work.
Sunshine?
Thank you. You all mentioned that, I forget whether it was either mayor or governor, but there was an application for like a 3 to 4 month extension to continue the work. Can you give me a summary of like what was done during that extension in order to move into the next phase of your work?
So what I remember about that, So what I remember about that time frame, we took it upon ourselves to notify the governor that we were staying. It really wasn't like a negotiation like that. We had really kind of said like, this is important to us, we gotta live here, you don't. And in some ways, it might have felt like smoke and mirrors to some of the political apparatus, but we took it seriously. So there was like a letter submitted like, hey, effective this date, we're doing this. The second thing was that we understood that implementation needed care, and we actually created a process by which we did an RFP for interested organizations to actually be the holder of the epicenter or the gravity around the calls to action. We behind the scenes did understand that things that exist, if they already exist, would probably not be the best. So we thought creatively about what if it was a partnership between, you know, organization A and B combined, and then maybe that would work. The public process that we used during some of this time of thinking about the extension was really intentionally, how do we think about it? The RFP was also, you know, shared transparently with people so they knew what to expect in advance, and conversations were had. I'm gonna go back to the earlier point that perhaps, in my opinion, why it felt like 15% at what David is saying was because like almost 100% of my job during the time of the commission was to actually create the soil during that time where commissioners would peel off and do presentations with folks who really wanted to know information, and they would only know it when you come to their territory to tell them in their way at their meeting. So while we were building the report and calls to action, we were also taking meetings, taking Q&A within the civic infrastructure, the faith infrastructure, the organizer infrastructure, the equity people in the space, anybody who thought they were, we did. And that helped so that when we released the report, or when it was time to say, okay, y'all, it's decision-making time for we, not me and not this table, the crowds began to come. So in addition to this RFP process to determine and identify, you know, let people testify about their reason why, and then go from there into selection, of which it became clear to the community, they agreed with us and we didn't say anything, like they're not ready. They're just not ready, we need something different. So we then had to, on the back end, because of the types of funds that we had, braided funds, they had limitations, there was very few funds that were free-flowing to implement much. We had to really take a lot of that time to think about how we were gonna take pieces and jigsaw puzzle to actually create and establish an entity that could move that forward. So those are some of the things we did, and I'm sure my colleagues have more. Oh, maybe not, okay.
Just one other piece was the, like, what were the components of the work moving for implementation? So kind of breaking that apart into what was like, it was the, like, continue to tell the story and communicate the work. There was advocacy as a piece of it. There was data and research. And I'm trying to remember what the last one was. Might have been around partnerships. But we kind of like identified, okay, here are the 5 like streams of work that have to happen to turn some of these calls to action into reality. And then that defined like some of the work that the organization did after.
And we anchored it in, what's that called? The backbone. Collective impact. The collective impact model. We had somebody come and speak about what that is and the research behind it and how it's structured. And we named the pieces in the RFP that we were looking for in alignment with a collective impact model, which has a backbone organization, and then it has continuous communication. There are certain elements that are present in that. And we use some of the meeting to talk about what that is and how that might support implementation of the report.
A lot of it was like leveraging the session to learn about a thing together, ask questions together, so that trust could increasingly be built. I won't say we totally earned it, but trust could increasingly be built because we were learning together. And decisions that we could have made and would have been right, we gave away on purpose and then created a different container because of that process.
Go ahead, Brian.
Leverage was a word you just used that kind of reminded me of the model. It sounds like that you've set up for the implementation is connected to the question of a concern, I guess, that I have with any new nonprofits or new causes or new initiatives is the cannibalism of resources in any area that, oh, I have an idea, so then these 3 form, oh, I have an idea, these 3 form, and everybody's And you mentioned that, 70 people or 70 groups going in, I don't know that I've even heard of that before, but, so kudos, first of
Yeah.
all. But I'm guessing that hasn't been on everything that you've done, that 70 groups have, right? So what,
I mean,
it has, well, I guess I'd put it to you this.
Yeah.
and a lot of things continue to not follow
Yeah.
that culture, but I think that was one of the things that was recognized is that a culture change had to happen in like the approach, and so the and is like, that was one of a string of times that sort of what we called radical collaboration, which was like a core principle of how we wanted the region to act, started to become real and tangible. So that did happen a number of other times, but not every time.
No, and so I guess, so when it doesn't, because inevitably, there's going to be things on youth, there's going to be a mental health, there's going to be crisis care, there's, all these things. So is there something that you developed ahead of time or learned afterwards that is a lesson learned that you can then share for us to deal with, okay, these may be 2, 3, 4 groups that may be competing for this resource, and or we've now created another group that may be competing for that resource? How did you deal with that? Or continue to, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's really how we're set up as a culture, right? And acknowledging that we almost reward the idea that you're going to create your own thing, and we pat people on the back, and everybody does the press release, and then they have them on the news. Like, that's, our culture rewards that. So I don't really take a position that energy is well spent to try to change that, but what might we offer or insert that maybe gets the next person to not do that, or offers incentive for not doing that, that develops shared understanding or shared language. So something that happened was that when we ended up creating an entity to access the remaining dollars, there were organizations who did racial equity or diversity inclusion or like culture competency work in the region that said we don't need another organization doing that work because we're already struggling and there are already too many people. And we said, wow, we've missed something if you think we're trying to set up a training organization, and let's have a conversation about that. So we had a 2-day summit where everybody came to the table, and we ended up mapping out the history of equity and inclusion, class dynamics, et cetera, in St. Louis. And through all of it, we kind of saw a pattern that would benefit from us fighting each other and not collaborating together. And also helped us understand why the reaction to the uprising that occurred after Mike Brown was killed was so disruptive and shocking to the system, because in the past there had been relationships in place to kind of keep that sort of uprising from happening. So it was really instructive to call in a conversation around that tension just from a learning and grounding perspective. And then we ended up mapping the work that we all did and realizing that it was complementary, not competition. And that the type of work this organization did is the type of work that this organization always turns down. And the type of work this organization does is actually a great first step before you go to that organization. And we'd never had that conversation before, and what it did was allow us to become partners and refer to each other, and it also helped us name, like, you see this corner over here that nobody's in, not even close to, that's what we want to do. And they were like, oh, you don't want to do what we do. And we're like, exactly. So I think that's an example of, we're not going to convince people not to do what we reward people to do in the system we live in, and what are the ways that we can bring ourselves into conversation and anchoring in what the reality of what we're working with, and perhaps operationalize the fact that we're all after the same thing, but we could actually be stronger together. Maybe like middleware.
So you mentioned the summit, obviously, it sounded like that would be something you organized, whether it was proactive or even in reaction.
And it was like a 6-hour meeting, 2 days in a
Sure,
row.
yeah,
where
we
had
call it,
lunch.
call it
Right,
whatever, yeah.
Right, I just called,
Yep,
I shouldn't have
yep.
used the fancy word.
Yep, no, it's a good word, it's a good word. But you'd mentioned the situation of, okay, it turns out this group's doing this, and they don't want to do this, it turns out this group's doing this, and they do this. did you find yourself as the sibling in between bringing them together, or was it a combination of maybe sometimes you were bringing and being like, actually, they don't want to do it. Do you want to do it because it's up your alley? Or then people started to naturally start to?
Yeah, I think something that people find annoying about me is that I would much rather create the conditions over a longer time for people to come up with the idea by themselves than prescribe, hey, I'd like you to do this, I'd like you to do that. And I think that that's a posture generally that our work took, and why we asked for more time and took more time and wanted more, socialize things and didn't prescribe decisions, because it doesn't stick if it doesn't come from the people who have to live it and hold it and sustain it. And if the idea doesn't come up, it's probably not a good idea.
And perhaps what was behind all that is that you were looking at this from an anti-racism value, not of scarcity, but
Correct.
abundance.
Abundance.
And so you're trying to encourage the more,
That's right.
and finding the resources because they exist. It's a fallacy
right.
that we don't have enough money
That's
for
correct.
this or that.
That's correct.
So I think that that's behind the approach that Brian is asking.
And we had a lot of practice getting yelled at, or a lot of practice being told we weren't trusted, and a lot of so at some point, you're like, we're not gonna win all of the hearts, so we might as well do what we think is right. So, sorry.
No, I'm kind of teeing off of Brian's lessons learned to just give them up front and see if other people jump in. Think about how you frame the desire for people to absorb the content of what you put out. We did not find it super helpful to be like, read the report. People like that felt flat, and in my interpretation, there are many, was this is a reflection of people's pain and what they've been through. The least you can do, since it may not be your actual experience, the least you can do is absorb the content of it. Since you don't live there, at least do that. So just think about the way with which you invite people into the content, with multiple ears and hearts and proximity to the things. We had a reframe of the People's Report and what that meant to folks, so just think about that. The second thing that I would offer is seize this moment and this opportunity to be as audacious, to your point, Ms. Veronica, as audacious and visionary as you can. Like, don't tell your own self no. It's really not about feasibility, because humbly, we're not creator. That's not our lane. So our lane is to put out as much as possible, and we'll know and believe something will stick, but we don't know what will stick. And the thing that you think will, it is the opposite, and it'll surprise you what sticks. So be surprised, but think that that's a good thing. And I would say, in retrospect, and I did it to model tonight, that, center as much as possible. Don't forget about the first family of Miss Massey. I feel regret that part of our charge in the way that it was created deflected from and deprioritized the actual first family. Were there ways that we could have, for example, when we prioritize out of the 189 calls to action, of which we thought 5 to 10 would have been great? Okay, so when we did 189, could we have brought leadership in, or the family in, or their representative, because it's a really sticky point at that time, to influence at all in some way? The report of the commission said Ferguson, but in a lot of ways our charge is really explicit about not getting into the principality specifics of what was happening. So I'm just saying this to say, you will continue to gain traction and commitment when first things are first and respected. The same way that we now know to acknowledge land that we sit upon, because we are not the first ones here. I feel the same way giving you advice now about the way with which you never let people forget that at the end of the day, too, a family lost Miss Massey. And it goes back to that. I think in some ways it did kind of take some diversions that I wish could have been different, if I could have planned for that.
Thank you for saying that, because we felt that. And it gives me the thought that, how do you fight the urgency? So everything that you guys just spoke of be patient. kind of let it organically, talking about implementation, I mean, letting people collaborate, talk about it, don't rush it. Let people say, hey, we can do this, or I can offer this, and all great sound ideas. But also, I battle that,
Well,
I don't want the dust to settle
hey,
under our feet.
we believe in both ends, so
Yeah.
earlier,
Oh, okay.
like, Sunshine was saying,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
you my first name like I know you, is that okay? Okay, Sunshine was saying, like, and things that are ready because there's a moment and people will say yes, maybe because they're embarrassed, like the art of embarrassment, like, I can say what I want to say. The art of embarrassment is a beautiful thing. Some don't like to be embarrassed, so they hustle for different reasons.
Sure.
Sometimes it's guilt, sometimes it's altruism.
Sure.
Who cares at some point in some of these things? So when you see that there's a moment and a window, it's not out the door yet, it isn't prettied up, it's not in the process and polished, but you got the yes and the authorizing environment. Yep, do it while you're being patient and cultivating and simmering. Yep, activate it, put some pressure on. So it really was both and. Although you
both
do hear us saying that, we are also like, yes, make it happen.
Yeah, and that in the same way, it's like leading out of scarcity into abundance, and that principle that came up in the partnerships.
Yeah.
It definitely is also the both and around cultivating the long-term, like, infrastructure that's needed for the work, so it's not a flash in the pan, but it also involved some showing up at, hearings, it involved some protests, like that story that I told about the out-of-school suspension, that included some protests, it included some, like, mailing of reports, it included, like, putting things out and holding them up, like, it included a lot of urgent action too, but I think something that would have doomed us is a year after the report had come out and for the person that existed for a year, it was like, how many of these things have you checked off? And if it wasn't 30 of them, it's a failure, and let's wash our hands of it, and
That's
let's
the
move
setup.
on. And that, is a setup. And so when you hear us talking about like the really building that capacity for the long term, it is that we have to reframe people, but that doesn't mean that we're not also urgently acting where there's opportunity.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Bree.
So when you guys talk about these called actions, and if I understand correctly, you presented like 189 recommendations. When you were making that list, how or did you decide like which ones were most important for you to go through? And if so, like what was the process? Like, did you discuss these are the ones that we need? The rest of them you can kind of like put on the sidelines? I'll start there.
So a few months before we were supposed to deliver the report, all the work groups were told, right, they needed to hand in all of their recommendations, and we need it by this date. And of course, the child well-being work group was the last to hand them in, and they were 3 weeks behind the deadline. And we ended up with like over 200 calls to action. And again, like they mentioned, the prevailing wisdom from some people was, okay, if the commission doesn't hand in these 3 top things, it's going to be a failure, and we've done a disservice to the process. And so we designed this method for the commissioners to vote on everything and score based off some criteria that had come up through the process, which for us was, is it unflinching? That was like a big word that was in our original charge from the governor, was to come up with unflinching policy recommendations. So is it unflinching? Is it urgent? Is it generational? And transformational. And so you'll see that those kind of are a mix, like some things that are transformational may not happen as urgently or be as feasible initially, or actionable was one of them too.
Actionable.
And so something that's more transformational might not be as actionable. Something that's generational maybe also doesn't have the urgency of like, people need to be fed, whatever that kind of like programmatic need might be. But having those criteria allowed us to kind of say what was most important to us and have some priorities raise up that were in different categories, or crossed in different ways. So after they voted on those, we had different ways of kind of displaying that information and locked the commissioners in a room across a day, but of course with sunshine rules, had to figure out a way to get everybody's input but not violate the transparency aspects of it. and so found a way for them to discuss and get it, and we were going to leave that room with like 10 at the max, and we left that room with 47 signature priorities. And through that process, we really realized, and you say this well too, but that we actually wouldn't be authentic to what we had learned during the process about how deeply systemic racism exists in our region, to say, here's the 2 things you can check off, and that's going to fix everything. And so we turned that around and said, region, we are challenging you that we're not going to get to a different place if we don't lean into this complexity. And so we're gonna look at this together. And we're not gonna look away from it. We're not gonna boil it down to 3 things. And that's really where the ethos of like, get in where you fit in, you are needed in this. And something that also came up for the commissioners as they were discussing, they were like, okay, yes, we all agree this is a really important call to action. Let's support that one to be one of our top ones, but then they'd be like, well, okay, if you do this one, but you don't actually invest in these other 2, that one's actually not gonna have the intended impact in 3 years. And so if we're gonna do this one, we have to do these 2, and that linkages, so we really had to change our mindset to be, don't run away from that, because it's not gonna be durable. It's not gonna actually have a long-lasting impact if you don't acknowledge that.
6:58 p.m.
No, seriously. And I think that's a really good example of being deliberate and letting things be organic, but also being urgent. So it was urgent that we got the report done, and if we had just tried to convince them in theory that it couldn't be 3, that never would have happened. But instead, we said, okay, we'll come up with this amazing Excel spreadsheet that you and Karishma made, that where you can rank them, and you rank your top 10, and then we showed them, here's the results of your work. It's 100 and something. And then they're like, well, we gotta get it down to at least 10. So then they moved from 3 to 10. So, okay, we're gonna put you in a room in 2 groups, and you're gonna get it down to 10. And then they had that discussion, so it became their idea, and they internalized the reality of the complexity. And after a couple years, it took me a couple years, I would say to people, there's one call to action. It's work on racial equity in this region. Here's 189 ways to get started. So this idea of like framing and how you frame it and how you help people see things becomes really, really important.
And then, since we're nearing like the end and hopefully gonna push for the extension, what would you guys do differently towards the end of your commission that you think maybe would give us a little bit of leverage to really make sure we're set up for success for when we have to step into the next whatever we do?
I think that what Bethany talked about earlier about like an authorizing environment for the work to happen and for the changes to actually happen is really vital and important. And Bethany did like heroic efforts around that, and a lot of the commissioners were tired after that process. And it had been a bruising process. It had been difficult. All kinds of things with the media.
Our phones were tapped. Our lives were threatened. I did not walk out. I was the last one out the meeting and had security, but some others did. I mean, it was that severe. Please keep going.
And so that reality meant like there needed to be that there needed to be champions for the work to like create the conditions for the work to happen moving forward. And I think attention around how are people ready for the marathon, not just the sprint, and really thinking about what that means, because you do need those voices in different spaces creating the openings for it to happen. But we were learning in real time, and it was such a sprint to get to the report, and it was so emotionally exhausting and involved, that became difficult after. And there were, all kinds of things with institutions saying that they were doing the work, but not actually doing the work, and doing all kinds of egregious sorts of announcements about how they were doing the work when they had not talked to anybody, and the money was not going to really what was supposed to be invested in, but people were exhausted, and we didn't have the energy and time to like do the coordination and to try and like tamp things down and get it back on track. So what does it look like to have that ongoing champion and be able to support that work? Would you say that?
Yeah, I think having, I'm thinking like politically and in like a game of chess, but like who are your corner pieces? And for your community, who does that have to be, right? Is that a bank and a university and a political, certain political body and a something sports team? Like, I don't know. But being intentional about having almost like reinforcements, like places that will reflect back the importance and reflect back the weight of it, so that people are invited into remembering that just because the commission has sunsetted, that now we're picking up a baton. Some intentionality around that, and within that intentionality comes capacity and or resources. So whether that's a political will, or that is funding something, or whatever that is, making sure that that is really seeded to pick up where people are gonna need a rest.
Yeah. Remind people of their agency. And it's not about the political leader with the title and the position, but we made a commitment going back into places and spaces in our spheres of influence that we would stay connected and that we would continue to push wherever we were. And so, as you think about implementation, I would suggest that you continue to think about the maps that you all have of influence and of power, little and big P, and network those with intention, especially now coming off of the wave of the momentum that you have, and just, make sure that your networks hold 10 years later. I mean, we still have a text group. We still talk about things. We assess other issues, and once you have a lens, you can't unlens your lens, and share that as much as possible. I would also say, think about intergenerational approach, things with which people can hold hands that don't have to be all young or excluding a group, but what are the things that really would be the tie that would bind multiple kinds of folks together the way that America says we can't, but we are? What are those things? Because people need to be inspired. People are exhausted of being hammered and being made to and almost coerced to. What could be most inspiring that gives people just a glimmer of possibility? Ride that wave and then build on that. Don't pick maybe for your priority the hardest thing to do because of whatever. Pick what inspires and galvanizes. There were people who said, okay, youth at the center, but we got elders, and they didn't feel part of it, right? So those are the things that I would offer.
The one other thing I would add, kind of in that same spirit, is also create intentional accountability and reflection points. So we didn't do this originally, but then started to do it a couple years after, is we'd have a state of the report. So I think starting maybe year 2 or year 3, we missed it the first year, it wasn't even an idea yet, but we would actually release something back out to the region to say, in a nice graphic way, with like pretty charts, so it wasn't a deep report that you had to read, like, here's what's moving, here's what hasn't moved at all, and here's who the people that would need to start doing something for these to move. Or this is moving a lot, let's point more energy in this direction. And so we started off doing it like broadly on the priorities of 47 signature priorities, and then later we ended up focusing in on specific areas. So we'd say, like, we did one that was the state of police reform, and we focused in specifically on the police reform call to action, what did move, what didn't move, what are the stories, like, let's elevate organizations that are doing the work. We told stories from people who had been impacted, people who were former police officers, who were reflecting on their time in it, and we activated. So to create those elements of activation moving forward.
Hence the name Catalyst in the leadership positions with intention.
I'm going
I'm
to
sorry.
self-authorize.
Sorry.
You're right.
You're right. We've been told, we've been given a roadmap, so we self-authorize. One of the challenges I have had is finding pathways of communication. Like, there are amazing groups doing awesome things, and I often find out about them 2 days after they happen.
Yeah.
and I don't know why it is, and I keep having these conversations, but are there ways of communicating that worked better for you all? Like, did you have meetings? Did you have chat strings? Was there a social media, a private social media group? Like, how and where did those conversations after the commission work is done, like, where and how did those happen?
Yeah, I think we primarily created those. Yeah, some formal, some informal. We at one point had a social media consultant, a storytelling team, which had a photographer, a audio capture person, and a videographer. We had a website development company, and we had somebody writing the report. So we had a lot of resources targeted toward communicating, but communicating in an engagement way that was like a give and take, a feedback loop, a translation and amplification. Something we focused a lot on was making the policy calls to action connect to people's lives. So we had one about Medicaid expansion, and we picked a white family in rural Missouri to be the focus of the story. We had one about tickets, fines, and fees in the municipality, and we picked somebody who's somebody who was going to dismiss it because they knew what type of person was affected by that. We picked the person that they wouldn't expect, perhaps. So there was intentionality and strategy in how we offered the information and offered people a pathway into the information. And it had, we also had a content group that would work with our commissioners to place stories and columns about things. So there was one that Starsky did on policy and programs that was done by that. So we took a multi-pronged approach. And I would
talk about hackathons.
Oh, right, we even had a hackathon.
Yeah, we had a hackathon.
We had a hackathon, yeah. There was an organization at the time that was doing a thing called Venture Cafe, and every week they had a happy hour with like 600 people in the innovation space. And we partnered with them to have people do a hackathon around issues in the report. So we really got innovative and also invested in, or partnered to be meeting people where they were with the information in ways that we strategically knew would connect in ways that they didn't expect. And even then, people were like, I didn't hear about the report. I didn't know you guys were meeting. I didn't, and that was 10 years ago. So I think the reality is that you are in relationship and you lean into the relationships and the conversations that are adjacent to you, and those will reach the people that you need to reach. There's a thing in ticket buying and in donor activity in the art spaces that the most likely person to buy a ticket is somebody who's already bought a ticket. The most likely person to donate is somebody who donated to the museum next door. So there's some marketing and communications reality to how we absorb information and how we receive it that I think is applicable here. And because your resources are limited and time is limited, you don't want to set your bar too high that you want like everybody to know about this, because everybody's not gonna be the one who needs to. But you can lean into those relationships and networks to really be strategic about where you're making the connection.
Sunshine.
Kind of going back to what you were saying, Joanne, about the respecting the patience of getting the work done, but also the urgency. It's making me wonder, one of the things that I've struggled with is all along, it's like I'm worried about putting things in this report that could be considered like the small wins. Like, we want to make sure something gets done. And my first thought was, I don't want any of that in there. I want only the big swings, because then they have to do theoretically, you know, we'll make sure we get something that really impacts this community. But I also recognize that they don't have to do anything, so it's like maybe we put some of the things in there that we actually think they might do, which I know it needs to be a little bit of both. But I'm wondering, did you go through your recommendations, like, and organize them by, like, timeframes? Like, these are quick, you know, easy, or like short-term requirements. These are, you know, a little more long-term. These are, you know, a 3 to 5 year plan, so that while you're getting some things done that meet the urgent needs, there's also some of that long-term structure. Like, I'm just wondering, how did you all break it up in that way? And if so, was that helpful to you all, or is it not really necessary?
I don't think we did that before the release of the report. It wasn't, I think our lens wasn't as much, what's the easy win versus the hard win? It was more like, does this align to our core values and principles of what we're trying to achieve? And some of those things were easier or some later, but we didn't really think about categorizing that way, and we didn't necessarily say, oh, will they do this easily?
Yeah.
Like, that wasn't the defining
Yeah, I mean,
factor,
like,
if that
after
makes
you
sense.
came up with your things organically, did you then, not like, did you think of, like, what could we get you? Okay.
Not
No.
until after the report was released.
Yeah, the only thing we did to, like, into the report was grouping, and we started by putting all 189 on Post-it notes, and then we grouped them together, and that's how we came up with the sections of the report. And then we also, within that, kind of had little groups that had, like, subcategories.
Priority areas.
Yeah, and so we would have like a little policy preamble, and a couple of benchmarks, like, there was, you'll see in the report, but like, we kind of wrapped around a structure for each one, and that was the most zhuzhing we did, was to categorize them and organize them.
Ryan?
So the sections in the report, it sounds like it kind of came together a little organically after ideas were submitted?
Yep.
And some moved across the, like, work group categories and kind of shifted.
Well, and actually, yeah, that was kind of where my question was getting at. With the work group categories, did you just kind of say, screw it, send us your ideas and we'll deal with organizing it after? Or was there ever, go ahead.
It mostly, so there were four work groups, and there ended up being really 3 sections of the report. So in some ways, we had like a work group that was on municipal courts and governance, and one that was on law enforcement, civilian relationships, and those kinds of mostly became justice for all. And then there was youth at the center, and then there was opportunity to thrive, the more economic health aspect of it. But there were some calls to action that ended up getting recategorized across them. So in some way, they kind of slotted into buckets, and in some way, some of them got grouped, especially when there might have been something that was like, I don't know, like one of those priority areas might have been about like fair housing in the Opportunity to Thrive section, and maybe the youth work group had done something related to youth and housing, and we're like, that is a connection point, but maybe that actually makes sense bucketed together, and like, this is what a fair housing system would look like, is it helps youth this way, and it helps these groups this way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess then, yeah, the minor follow-up then is, as you were getting close and maybe heard, hey, youth and housing, you guys have 2 different things that are kind of the same. Did you say, we'll deal with it as the full commission?
As a staff.
Or as a
So,
staff,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, our process was the working groups presented to the commission either affirmed or sent back stuff, and then eventually the working groups were done.
Yeah.
Right? And then we presented the commission with a slate of everything, and they did what they needed to do, and then the staff kind of took it back and said, okay, we're gonna organize this and figure out how this fits. And then I think there was a meeting where we had them approve the 3 categories.
While one group still kept sending more as we were trying to do it. Yeah.
Go ahead, Brooke.
So since we're kind of talking about like the bodies that are involved, and I know you guys are coming from a city that is way larger than we are, but like realistically, could you give us an idea of like how many people we need to have involved? Like, you have these ecosystems, like how many people are involved in these ecosystems, or like how large are we thinking? Like, is it complete city involvement? Is it like, are we hiring staff now? Like, what is the process with the amount of people that are involved now that it's an organization?
I guess I would maybe answer in two ways. That it's hard to answer completely without knowing the scope and scale and leverage points, because I guess my ultimate answer would be like that should drive what the structure is. Like, we were very like form follows function, and I think so often it's like, oh, here's the form, here's what it needs to be, regardless of what the function is, or the function hasn't gotten clear yet. But we're like, we'll figure that out. So we were really like, how do you make the structure follow the need? It's hard to answer because it might be like, if it's focused on one specific area, like, yeah, it's hard to answer specific, because we were thinking about more of a broad, like, ecosystem approach. So I can tell you like what Florida through Ferguson adding capacity, if that's helpful at all. Or?
I guess I think I'm trying to say, like, once we go from like just having this commission, and then I'm assuming, depending on if we decide to continue the work groups or not, like, we have some staff, there are people with like titles. Would it be a recommendation to like grow the amount of people that are like actual staff that have like actual positions, or like continue kind of the commission style, but it's under an organization instead of a commission, or like which? Does that make more sense?
It makes sense. I tend to want to right-size the work to the capacity available. So we designed a big thing that we felt would meet the vision, and it was like multiple people, multiple departments, multiple things. And that wasn't, there was not the funding to do that. Nobody was interested in funding that. So like, okay, at first we had 2 people. It was you and me, right? Yep. So the right sizing of that work was, we're going to respond to people who are interested. We're gonna try to socialize some of the ideas. We're gonna do some internal work to like figure out how we might do some storytelling around this.
Do coalition.
And do some facilitation, right? And there's, just like with the policy, with the calls to action or any list of demands, there's like a push and a pull. So if we want to do this whole report, it's going to take more than 2 people. If we only have 2 people, here's where we think the priorities are and what we can do. I think we can get very caught up from an anti-racist lens of like building an institution.
Yes.
And building an institution is not the work that is going to bring us justice and be more free. So how are we identifying where it is that there can be leverage and where there can be shifting, and resourcing that in whatever way that means? One of the ideas we had was like, what if these 5 corporations loaned us an executive for a handful of years, and that executive was going to be over this part of the opportunity? Maybe a transportation organization loans us an executive that's going to be dedicated to the transportation calls to action for a year. We could work with that, and we could help support that work. That's not something that happened, but that was one of the ideas we had. But I think the shortest version is like, resource what it is you expect to happen. Because often what happens is we make big promises and then we don't resource them. We're really, like, we could bet that will happen. So whatever you can do to keep that from happening is what I would recommend.
What we have in common, that I could kind of just share also, we have employers, so think about your employer champions, even if it's just one. You know, you heard my bio about being a reverend, so you just need 2 or 3 gathered. You don't need thousands and millions. You just need 11, and you also know that one was a Judas. It just happens. So you just accept that as true, and it helps you with implementation to not feel like, I don't have critical mass. You got 2 or 3, you got critical mass in some areas. And so I'm sharing that employers, your civic infrastructure, your faith community, just a few good electeds, the education sector, and then like people hide behind or we miss really good people because we think about systems and orgs and nonprofits. So I would offer like inventive disruptor kind of folk who cares where they sit or employed, but they themselves are the catalyst, and bridge builders. You need both, right? Because you need people who erect shop, and you need people who want to kiss you and make you feel better. You need all of that. And I think regardless of how large or small our locations are, if you got those and tap into that, that's a really good start.
I had one to build, to build off of Bree's question, like the resources and what all is needed, so to speak. Actually, by the way, that was the stakeholders, that list, that
Yeah.
was more or less what I was kind of getting at.
Okay, so I
For what
answered
it's worth.
something.
So,
Okay, cool.
yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, so one of my kind of last couple questions, one was on costs. There's money costs and there's time costs. Outside of personnel, what have been the top costs? Cost of money, maybe, but also time, because sometimes that can eat up a lot.
I will ask Nicole to think about the specifics and give her time to think about it, because it felt to me like a lot of our costs were actually in fighting the distractions to make sure we didn't get it done. What we haven't talked about so far is like the fight to actually get it done. So between sunshine law distractions and having to look through legal and having to spend time in front of a camera you paid for it, about my salary, which was a nonprofit salary, but they made it seem like I made millions and I never got the raise I was supposed to this day. That was a lot of the emotional time sink and distraction and some of the budget. The other ones were because we had federal funding sources that you could only use these economic development dollars on houses, or for a minute, like they were obsessed about tax credits. That had nothing to do with what we were doing, but they wanted to push tax credits because that's what the civic people had, right? So I'm thinking about costs in terms of like sunk costs and testimonies and things. My actual job, I feel, was to keep the team and the commission extremely well, to remind people that regardless of the fact that we didn't see it yet, it is a finished work. We would repeat time and time again when it looks like what it looks like right now. Do I put little or small in? What word do I put in? We would just repeat to each other, whatever it is, it's a finished work, and we're gonna get to it, and it's gonna happen and be amazing, right? So I think the other part of my job was to like care for the process, and in caring for a process with integrity, the outcomes, they come. Being transparent and caring for that is cheaper than fighting off the rest of this stuff. And then hopefully Nicole can remember the budget, because all I remember was like sitting at United Way trying to piecemeal how we were gonna do this, because we couldn't pay for this with this, but we could with this. Foundations gave, $100,000, sometimes a pop. That was our, revenue beforehand. And then I'll tell you, like, the state of Missouri said that they would, and then they blocked the funds that were supposed to come so that we couldn't get them, and the work had to happen. We did have loaned executives from some of the employers who believed in the work, but we could never say it publicly. So for a lot of time, we spent time being shunned. I felt like I had a scarlet letter until the report came out, and then I was cool. But for quite a long time, there were threats, and they were real. It wasn't the same as people on the ground, so I'm not trying to make myself co-equal, but I'm saying that there was an emotional expense. And I'll also share the personal costs so that everybody else, the public, thinks about these things as you don't, about people's time who sit up here every day. I became so disoriented that I could not, in the dark, find my way to the doorknob of my own home. And you may not be able to say it because it feels like you need to stay gathered to represent so much that's going on. I'm saying for them that it is work you never stop thinking about. You are obsessed about doing well and right. The nightmares are real. The optimism that people are trying to have you hold, and yet everything is on the line. And so, 10 years later, that feeling does not go away, because it's your people, because it's your people, right? So, to the extent that I'm talking about for y'all now, I'm not even saying self-care. I'm saying thank you very much. Like, whatever it is you need to refuel, do that, because there are nights that I really, with as much as I have and the faculties and the supports that I have, there were fracturing parts of my mental health and my body that I barely got back. And I know you know what I'm saying, but other people need to know. And I also remember, probably like you, people that didn't trust me. I felt like I needed to prove myself, blah, 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 blah. You're never quite good enough. You're never quite in the category to be justified. And yet, people begin to see your sincerity, your genuine trying, and they give you a break. And our community told us, no electives have come in here and carried. Ain't nobody else done it, so guess what? You're it. And we were like, all right. And when people see the matching energy, it does feel like a we after time. So yeah, okay, yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. And even after all that, I don't have specific numbers. The commission itself, I think publicly is somewhere how much that was, but I think you're talking more, I think it was 1.1 million? Yeah.
Yes.
And that's what was, that didn't have, that had some in kind, but not all the in kind. It's a number that we came to. The implementation, I think that we started with about $300,000. And I think the first year, that was probably all we had. And we ultimately, I think you would have the answer after that, what the budget was after that first year.
Yes, but it so depends on how you're setting it up.
Right.
Is it this networked approach where there's a set of key coalitions and you need like just some node support at the center? Is it an organization that's, because in the end, Forward Through Ferguson, when I was the ED, we had a set of core areas. So we did advocacy, like actually, advocacy efforts, campaigns to implement calls to action. We had what we called racial equity capacity, which was like building the deep work of getting out of scarcity into abundance, both and breaking down white supremacy within institutions to act differently. And then we had communications and storytelling. And those were kind of our three areas of work. And that ended up being, it took us a long time to grow there, but that ended up being like $1.2 million.
And that's,
so, but it's
yeah.
like so
No,
how you're.
those areas, that is kind of what I was getting, because the reality is, I don't know how much there will or won't be, and, that can change in a year or two.
And that was 10 years ago.
Yeah. And so, like in those categories of, in the storytelling, actually, a lot of time or money when that overall, they each technically had all the attention that they deserved, but this happened to just take up more of something.
Well, and when we were first starting, because I'm a hammer and everything's a nail, the communication strategy was where we invested a lot of the money, because we didn't necessarily have multiple people to go out and sit in multiple meetings, but we could create a really compelling info video. We had a set of infographics we did about the cost of inequity and inequity in birthing weight, inequity in asthma, inequity, and we had a series of we continued the storytelling with we had a Humans of St. Louis sort of thing, like Humans of New York. We did a lot of storytelling with specific groups and people working on calls to action. So it was
Implementation tools.
Yeah, we made implementation tools. So we did a lot of that with the little money we had when we had less money.
Yeah.
Veronica, you had a question?
Thank you. I wanted to change a little bit. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I hear you very deeply when it comes to losing sleep and being concerned and worried, particularly at a time, at this historic time, in which doing anti-racism work can get me denaturalized, right? So I have two questions. One is a hypothetical scenario. And one of the questions that I have is, knowing what you do today in relation to racial equity and justice, and understanding the intersectionality of the communities that are historically overpoliced and subject to brutality, that suffer crisis and mental health crisis and so on. How would you approach today in the current climate, political climate. Alternatives to community safety and policing and access to mental health when we are seeing our neighbors being kidnapped by ICE, right? When we have very specific notions about who belongs here, about people's perceived migration, status, and basically about racial profiling, right? So at a time of increased mental health crisis and fear in our communities, how would you see this equity and justice work happening in which communities can embrace intersectionality?
I'll start by saying that what I'm learning now is I would actually blur the lines of the geographic boundaries. I would think in terms of the statewide networks or the collection of partners. I would partner with Ring and create a system with Ring cameras that's antithetical to what other people think about. I mean, I literally, so for example, with my funder hat on right now, we have a service area we can fund, that's it. But ICE and the way with which, for example, that intersectionality is manifesting, we need to be thinking beyond where we think we can fund to the partnerships that we have in other locations and spaces and start like brokering these relationships to network and fund the planning, and I don't mean the plan, I mean fund the actual strategy, the co-conspiracy level strategy, and not, public eyes and the format that we just told you 10 years ago works, but a way with which we can really foster and fuel an accelerated network of trusted people that is beyond how we typically think about rural-urban myths and this county, that county myths to like, nah, we is we, because right now this population is being tested for what's getting ready to happen to me. And the narrative, I think, still has not caught up. So like we did right by really investing deeply in narrative, which was unheard of, and I don't even think we had words like this at the time, that was where to put the money, because truly we are aching for a we frame that we still don't have. Mm-hmm. And I think lifting up folks to say, like, guinea pigs today, us tomorrow. Guinea pigs today, us at 5 o'clock, not even tomorrow. Yeah. And so I think that it's something about the way we've compartmentalized our geography. Mm-hmm. This coming from a state of Missouri that is surrounded by 8 states, one of which is Illinois. Mm-hmm. The Midwest has to think very strategically about a we that is truly not flyover East Coast and West Coast, and we better get we fast. That's how I am learning right now.
Well, one of the things that worry me the most, it's really hard to think. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I started it. It is. It's real.
Is the fact that, anybody who knows me, I tire people out when I talk about who's not sitting at this table, who are we leaving behind.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And, Sunshine and I and Brian have had this conversation about, well, how many is so many? And I keep thinking, you guys did it in such a way that for me was so meaningful. And I don't care if you have done 250, because you left a historical record. And I'm afraid that we're not going to leave that historical record if we don't include our immigrant populations in the Massey Commission in the ways that we should. And we don't reflect their fear and their interaction with police, and the fact that they didn't even call police anymore because they're too afraid. So they're rather, and I always say this, they rather bleed at home, which is already what we saw in the first term of our president. So I'm always thinking, and knowing what you did, my second question, now that I'm gathering my thoughts, was how do you currently foster multicultural partnerships outside this binary of black and white, right? To truly approach participation and representation in terms of justice and equity work through your organization, right? So that we can, beyond this idea of racial solidarity, really include the people that are really hurting, and that we know are living in the shadows with status because they're too afraid, right? How do you approach that?
Yeah. First, thanks so much for sharing that. Like, really appreciate it. I think in what you were saying and what Bethany was saying too, like that idea of we is like really broken in our nation right now. And to your first question, like thinking about it now, I think if we were to do this in today, like that idea of democracy and what more democracy across our institutions look like, so that it's really of the people in a place of all statuses, is really vital. And how I've definitely seen ways that we build solutions or implement policies that didn't actually have methods for people to be heard, often marginalized voices that are so often like swept to the side, and because we didn't include that as part of the solution itself failed later, or was retracted later, or wasn't as powerful. So we've been thinking a lot about how to build, because the small is all, right? Like so much of what's happening nationally like reflects what's built up from locally. So thinking about in the solutions, like how to build that access and that voice, and what you're talking about with like the multicultural efforts, I think is really vital too, and really pushing out of that binary. Like I've definitely seen, at least in St. Louis, like coalitions really have to reckon with that and say, hey, actually, even though we're, going towards racial equity or anti-racism, we're actually excluding voices that need to be at the table. And if we're actually going to build the power to make these changes where we're running up against walls, we can't be dividing ourselves further. So I definitely see that be a place of like learning and continuing like working through that in St. Louis. This is more on your first question, but in the years post, just thinking about the police reform call to action that we had in there, but as we continue to learn, something that became a really big focus of Ford through Ferguson, which none of us are at the organization right now, but have been connected in various ways across time, but alternative first responder systems ended up being a really big focus. Things like mental health calls, social calls, traffic stops, really exploring the models around where those do not need an officer that has like this criminal power of arrest, is like not actually what meets the need of a community member in that time, and comes with so much other weight and trauma and history. And so we really started to invest in what does it look like to have those alternative first responder models happen locally. And so some of you all may have looked at some of them, but things like Cahoots, which exists on the West Coast, and Denver Star program.
Crisis intervention teams.
Crisis intervention teams, and really looking at those like, co-responder can be an improvement, but really thinking about like separate response as well, and that being a really powerful tool.
The thing I will add is the disaggregation of data.
Yes.
So if you disaggregate the data, you can look at who's really there, not just what we saw or what our feeling is, but like who's here. And then you can also ask who's missing. You're like, ooh, we disaggregated this data and there's 0 people of this group here, but we know that our population is actually this much, and so where's the gap, where are the people? And I think that being something that I talk about a lot in my work at Washington University is about the fact that that diversity is a multiplicity of things. It isn't 2 things. And if we're not specific about what we're talking about, we might actually not be having the same conversation. So if we can look at the data or be specific about which group of people, we're actually talking about people who didn't finish high school, or we're talking about people who play baseball, or we're talking about people who hire cleaning people, like whatever the group is, being specific about who we're talking about and using data to either show us who is or isn't there can often be a entry point that isn't about the concept of who's included and who isn't, but it's like letting us work off of a piece of paper that says, here's who's represented, and oh, why aren't these people represented? Or maybe this is a different group popping off as underserved than we thought in the first place.
I just wonder if, and this is a true question, I don't have a recommendation, but just like Oppression Olympics doesn't work, I don't think Invisibility Olympics will either. And so I wonder if there's a way with which in humanity for people, everybody, raise your hand in this room if you've ever felt invisible by somebody or something. It is the tie, see what I'm saying? It's the tie that binds us together. Is there a way to tap into an experience that doesn't have to extract from the details of such horrific things all the time? Like, I'm not trying to say don't say it, but just, you know, I just know as a Black person that when I am in a fishbowl having to explain to people what my experience is as a Black woman to get you to move, like that has got to stop. It's got to stop. So who becomes the ally in your space that protects you and those that are represented by your experience that can't be you, that it's got to be someone that doesn't have the same risks and talks about the promise in addition to the pain of invisibility and calls people in to a different something because they're expecting Veronica to say the thing, but they may not be expecting Susan. So like, what are the ways with which we are like helping you to not have this load? That's our job, that's not your job. And how can we swap up? Because the one thing that I feel like is very effective is to like almost decenter people in what they expect and to expect the unexpected, but not in a harsh way, but actually in a love way, right? And to model the actual community that we want to become. People believe it when they see it, so we start acting like it until we become it. And we can do that right now. We don't need the data that report to do that.
Okay, so I have a question, and it went back into the calls to action that you all had. You mentioned putting them into different categories. A couple of them were generational and transformational, understanding that those categories may take a little bit longer to see any results from or to have any progressive work done on it. So within one of the work groups that I'm in, we're really interested in building accountability. And I think in a conversation with a friend, the accountability piece is only a piece of it, but really it's that culture shift. Because you can build accountability all you want, but if the culture doesn't shift towards what you're trying to change, how does that work? So I was wondering, first, since it's been 10 years for you all, have you seen some of those transformational or generational categories come to life or be worked on? And what's been successful, and how can we learn from you in terms of strategies for next steps so that we don't only get these small wins that Sunshine was talking about, but these transformational ones for our communities?
I'll just add one piece of the puzzle, two that are coming to me. One you didn't ask about, but it's coming to me to say is people are gonna need to see the heart and not just the cerebral of people in this work to believe it and wanna risk something. So as, you know, it's happening here, there's a lot of emotion and then it's like, get the tissue and right? We're gonna have to figure out how to crack open the humanity because it's painful and people that bear witness to that believe you and move forward. To your point though, I would say start cultivating your own champions that don't exist today, but you'll need 10 years from now. Start it now. So you're looking to the faces of the names and the familiars now, but the real long game is like, who are the folks that you're cultivating right now to say yes to you later?
right? And like invest in that. You kind of get what you get in the moment, yay, but the long game is the real strategy. So who are those wins, or those folks, or that appeal that you're gonna make, or those young people, or people who, you know, I think we do assume that folks are stuck where they're stuck and they're gonna stay there. And I think that there really are movable people that when you, like, take no one off the table and don't assume that they're always gonna say no. Just like, because there's something special about it, people can pivot and just look for the pivot spot. Because I do believe that a lot of people have them and we just like give up before we start.
I think when we said transformational and generational, it was two-pronged. I think part of it is how long it might take, but part of it is the impact it will have. And how oriented in like addressing a root cause something might be. I think of the example of disaggregation of data, and that was something we talked about a lot, and I think it was a call to action in the racial, yep. And when COVID happened, it just so happened that a number of people who were in a room had been part of that and said, we should start disaggregating our data. And we did from the get-go, and nobody argued. It wasn't a fight. It just happened because we'd been talking about it for 5 years at the time, 5 or 6 years, right? The other thing that came to my mind was a graph. So that summit, that was a meeting with lunch over 2 days. We came out of that with a framework that's on the website, Path to Racial Equity. And it's a grid, and it lays out the levels of individual, organizational, and broader culture. And then across it has awareness, understanding, and transformation. And what we plotted on there was that some people worked mostly with individuals around their ability to understand difference, inequity, et cetera. Some people worked with their awareness of those things. Some people worked with organizations to understand how their policies and practices may disproportionately impact people who worked there. And then other people worked on policy changes at the regional level or at the state level. And so that was like transformational at the culture level. And mapping that is helpful to see, oh, I'm an organization, but I'm doing individual awareness work. So I'm an organization, I have organizational power, I make policies, I impact people's economic viability, and I'm only investing in like days where people can go volunteer or individual professional development. And I could, as an organization, be changing some policies and some benefits to allow people to have their paychecks go further, or something else that they might decide to do. Or as an organization, I have sway at the regional or state level, and I should use that. So that grid, if you Google a path to racial equity forward through Ferguson, it'll come up, it's a PDF, helps to locate people and sort of where they're aiming or where their work is, and maybe invite them to level up a little bit. Or perhaps they have called themselves doing this like big transformational regional work, and if they look at it, they're like, oh wait, I'm actually working over here, which is needed, but it's not where you thought you were aiming, and what could you do to go ahead and aim there? So reflecting back to people and giving them context sometimes is a big invitation to sort of move the ball down the field.
We'll have one last question.
Metrics of success were one of my kind of questions, although it kind of sounds like there's a whole lot of different other wins. Getting somebody to level up is a win, I would say. But the two things that I thought of that maybe you could help me understand whether I know there's not a perfect metric, but you had mentioned getting the schools to talk about discipline in a room and agree to, that seems like that's check. You mentioned maybe after the second year you started to do the updates. I'm guessing in particular that's definitely a wait, did we or didn't we? How did you decide whether that box was checked on one of those?
Well, it actually, somebody brilliant on the team, Dr. Christopher Furtado, ended up designing a lot of that, and really started to realize that, yeah, people wanted that checkbox, but the reality is, how root cause oriented was it? How durable was it? So like when we did the state of police reform, one of the calls to action was to create a civilian oversight board for the police department that would then be able to take on different complaints that people would put forward and then act on them. That happened. The culture of the place didn't change. The way that it regulated meant that the police, the force investigative unit internally actually slow-walked a lot of the things and never changed the procedure where if you handed in the complaint form, but you didn't purposefully mark this part of it, it only went to the force investigative unit, it didn't go to the public commission, and then that commission, or that body didn't have the subpoena power to actually force the information that they needed to investigate a claim and follow through. So we quickly realized that it was deeper than just the check, and a lot of it was like defending the win, and also had the culture shifted around it, and were there ongoing accountability metrics. So we started to track it in several different ways to like push back on people to say, there's this spectrum of institutional / policy change, like what's the process by which, you know, a coalition is working on this, or they've named it as a priority, or the policy has been checked. And then there's also a spectrum of, is that having the intended impact at a population level? Are those actually moving? And so we actually called it movement mapping, is the term that we ended up creating to really push people beyond, is it just something that's checked, right? It's ultimately, at the end of the day, a material impact that we want in people's lived experience in their everyday life and their access to certain freedoms. And that's not just a policy checkbox. So we had to kind of push people to say, okay, track the process of systems change happening, but also track if that's having its intended population level impact. And if those two things aren't happening together, then it's not actually, don't pat yourself on the back for it being achieved. Does that get to it?
And there's really a reframe. Like, one of the things we said a lot is process is product, which is not very fun and finite, but that's a great example of like, okay, we did the thing, but it's not moving anything. One of the tools that I still use today is the shorthand of the numbers behind the numbers. There was a push that if the police department reflected in demographic makeup of the community, that relations would be better. And we had somebody look at the path from deciding that you wanted to be a police officer all the way to becoming commissioned officer. There were 13 steps, and all 13 steps were handled by 3 separate groups of people. But nobody had ever looked at that. And when we looked at the place where you might have like 100 recruits of color and only 5 became commissioned officers, and so people had opinions about why, but nobody had looked. And it turned out that the handoff between the first and second department and the process inside the last department were the places where there was the biggest fall off. But if nobody had looked at that, we'd just be pushing, like I just saw in a report recently, invest a lot in recruiting. And I was like, I literally give a presentation on how that's not the way, because that's not the place in the process where we have the problem. So there's a reframing or an invitation as you deliver these calls, these recommendations or these goals, that they're an endpoint or they're perhaps a doorway, but until the outcomes match the outcomes you're seeking, your recommendation might not be the right one. And there has to be a certain amount of understanding and openness to looking at the process alongside the recommendation, and a reality that you didn't do all of that as you made the recommendations, but here's our best get. This is the best place to start.
That is an incredibly nuanced mechanism that you would have found. How did you find that?
That was after I left Ford through Ferguson. So it was the commission, and then I was at Ford through Ferguson for a year, and then I went to the mayor's office. And at the mayor's office, there was a national funder who was funding 5 cities to do equity indicators, and we partnered with 3 other organizations to come up with a set of equity indicators as modeled by the Institute for Government at SUNY New York. And we had a report that showed all the different You measured, you disaggregated the data, you looked at which group had the highest access and lowest access for a bunch of different indicators that we based off of the report. And one of them was around police department demographics, and we had the researcher, we just used that as an example, but we found that in a number of spaces that we pushed for something at this end that had a bunch of process behind it, and nobody had any insight into that. So that was 3 years and 5 or 6 different partners and me at 3 different jobs.
Could we
Yeah.
get a link for that report?
Yeah, I want to,
I think it's still up on the website.
I think it's still up as well.
Okay.
my metrics, St. Louis Equity Indicators, my metrics for success would be to think about what muscle memory and infrastructure is left behind that will be able to be called upon for the next tragic something. That is really important. We just had a pretty horrific tornado with which there's something about something that there was some muscle memory that was called upon in a really unique way that we don't take credit for, but there's something there. So think about muscle memory, and imagination is infrastructure, by the way. But like, think about what infrastructure is. The second one, I'm accessing my inner Reverend Starsky Wilson, is how are the children? The answer to that question indicates something, because for children to be well, it means a whole lot has to go into that, because they're not orbs that float around by themselves. And then the last one that I'll give is, I'm trying to read my own left-handed handwriting, y'all. When we had this issue, and then you'll understand my recommendation. We had this issue where we were really understanding that the way that municipalities were actually generating revenue was on the fines and fees of ticketing, particularly Black folks, right? So it's not sufficient. So the call to action was like, you gotta stop with the discrimination of fines and fees. Great. But then the municipality doesn't have revenue. So then what? So I'm saying, if you can think about a way to, if you're taking away of something and you're wanting people to build a different muscle memory and do a new thing, also offer the new thing too. Because it helps people, we don't tell babies like, hi, 6 months old, walk. Like, we hold their hand a bit and we, put the right shoes on. People have to hold on to something. I know people like, abolish the police, but you have to have something to hold on to while you're looking for the new reality. So in your recommendations, when you're like, abandon this, terrible, true, but also give thought to the vision of what's possible at the same time. And I feel like people are more inclined to not replicate a nastier thing to try to generate revenue or whatever it is, because you're giving them a path. So those are the 3 things I would say for impact. We tried.
Okay, listen, thank you, Adam. I can't thank y'all enough for sharing all that valuable information right at the point that we really need it. And like Sunshine just said, we should have had y'all at the beginning. But we appreciate you. Can we please just thank them for this? Okay, we're going to move on, and you guys can take your seat. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to the public comment phase of the meeting. Before we open the floor to public comment, I want to acknowledge the invaluable role of the community voices in this process. Your input is both welcomed and essential. We ask that when you step up to give your comments, that they be made in the spirit of productive dialogue. We ask that the speakers that have signed up to be ready to line up in order of your presentation. I have the list here in front of me. This is a one-way comment opportunity, not a Q&A for commissioner response. Each speaker will be allowed to speak for 5 minutes and will be called in the order in which they signed up. Our public comment period is limited to less than 1 hour. With that, I have Beth as our first speaker. Beth Langen.
Is that better? Yes. Okay, all right. Thank you. My name is Beth Langen. One of the things, as I read the Ferguson report, I noticed that it focused on some of the intersection of identities of Michael Brown that they found most salient, his race and his youth. And on page 15 of that report, it noted that all of the work groups were asked to, quote, intentionally apply a racial equity lens to the work. In the Massey Commission 6-month reports that I read, I noticed that one of the work groups did identify racism as a problem, and another work group identified anti-racism as a solution. The role of race, I think we all know, cannot be considered a given, not in a white-dominant culture with white-dominated systems where there is overt pressure to deny racism's existence, to erase any evidence of it, or to silence anyone who speaks the truth about it. Racism needs to be identified as the problem, or the solutions won't change it. Each of us brings to the table intersecting identities. Ms. Sonia Massey, Mr. Earl Moore, and Mr. Gregory Small Jr. were Black, and they were each disabled, debilitated, made far more vulnerable by physical and/or mental health conditions. They existed at the deadly intersection of race and disability. How that intersection occurs is fundamental to understanding and correcting how they experienced disproportionate violence at the hands of the people and the systems that should have protected them from harm. It's not small, it's not unique to Springfield. The data they mentioned not being disaggregated is what's hard to see, but the prevalence of both people of color, Black and brown, and people with disabilities who are incarcerated, harmed, is profound. So I'm here to ask that you recognize some foundational truths about those intersections when you're crafting your recommendations. First of all, when I use the term disability, that's far more complex at the intersection of race and disability. Blackness itself was once considered a disability. The shape of the skull was used to justify enslavement. It is at that intersection of race and disability that systems have justified medical experimentation, higher rates of psychosurgery, institutionalization, the withholding of medical treatment, and the use of violence to control Black bodies. A quick word about ableism, and I want to share, and I see I'm running out of time, that the definition of ableism is broader than we sometimes see. It places value on people's bodies and minds based on a societally constructed idea of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. That applies to both people of color and people with disabilities. If you're a person of color, you experience ableism, whether or not you have a disability or not. The white construct of disability denies the violence of racism, the violence of poverty. The other thing the presence of disability has done has been used to falsely paint that the fact that injuries and death of Black men and women are seen as excusable. It happened with George Floyd. When the autopsy came out, they blamed his heart disease and his use of substances rather than a police officer with his foot on his neck for 9 minutes. When you get to your recommendations, I would ask this. Unless you're recommending the whole scale, well, I'm running out of time. Please look. Are you sure?
Yes.
Okay. Please view your recommendations through the lens of racial equity first. and always. And unless you're recommending the wholesale discarding of the systems that led to the outcomes of death and grievous injury, your challenge is to make recommendations, not how white dominant systems can serve everyone, but how they should have served Ms. Massey, Mr. Moore, and Mr. Small. That may require dismantling racism. It does require dismantling racism and ableism in those systems. And it's also about violence. You're dealing with systems that prioritize and demand compliance. When somebody's ability or willingness to comply is compromised and misread, when people of color are already assumed to be aggressive and untrustworthy, people of color die. For all the systems that you're examining, please make sure your recommendations reflect how race, disability, and poverty operate to disproportionately harm those who are multiply marginalized. I hope your recommendations find an audience that's ready and welcomes all of your recommendations. And one of the most powerful things I heard from those from the Ferguson Commission tonight was that it just doesn't matter because these recommendations aren't for them. Just bring it home. Put it out there. Make sure that while you're making these recommendations, the paramount factor that you're looking at is that far too many Black men and women have been injured or killed, and that's what matters. Not prioritizing anyone's comfort, making recommendations that the system is ready for. Never lose the plot, and please don't miss this moment. We're grateful to you. We're counting on you. And if it takes a long haul, a whole lot of us will be there with you. They counseled patience, but please don't let patience ever be permission for dragging their feet. So, thank you. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Mr. Thomas Davis.
I was intrigued by the presentation. I was intrigued by the language. I was intrigued by the alliteration, all these words starting with I, imagination, involvement, intentionality. I'll get to some more of those in a minute now that I remember I've got some notes. But let's focus on what we're doing. And I'm so glad the commission is already thinking about implementation, because how can you make recommendations without thinking about the outcome? That's like a trial lawyer not knowing the final argument, you know, working on the opening statement, but giving no thought to the finish of the trial. A call to action is proactive. A report is reactive. Demands, insistence for change are audacious, bold, and radical. Radical means getting to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem, as Beth eloquently noted, is still racism. It was racism a year ago. It'll be racism a year from now. Recommendations, and language is important. Words are extremely crucial. Recommendations are directed toward policy. Actions and accountability, however, are what creates transformational change, culture change. We haven't talked very much about the police. The police in St. Louis, it's my understanding, they are almost as racist as Oakland, California, and that is saying a lot. So transformational change, that's what you seek. That's what we've sought from the beginning. We've sought a variety of different things, including recall, But the best reports and the best recommendations, the most cogent and well thought of plans fail without involved implementation. And there we go with the I words again. The community and government engagement, that is extremely important. So how do you do this? Well, I've got a whole list of I words that we've used tonight. You involve. How do you do that? You invite. I think that this commission could draw up a list of a top 100 of accountable bodies, as the term was used tonight. Everything from businesses, universities, hospitals, all these social services, maybe it would exceed 100. But to get your name on that list, to be invited by the Massey Commission to get involved and invest in the implementation, that might be impressive to some people that otherwise are not engaged. It would work on their vanity, so to speak. So once you invite people, you have to inspire them. And I agree that the school children obviously are the future victims, the future enablers of racism, the future people who can become champions. You've got the whole diverse array in the schools, and we've got problems of racism in every school in this city. And I'm sure I went to a really small rural high school in Cuba, Illinois, and there was no black person there, but there was racism. You don't need black and brown to have racism. So you want to inspire. How do you do that? Well, let's do some presentations at these high schools. Let's get engagement from whatever student groups that are so concerned without us adults even being aware of it, in social issues, in the fascism, in all the stuff that is happening. They are concerned and they are worried about their future. They have ideas. There's another word. And we just need to identify all the accountable bodies and invite and inspire those future champions. To do that, I would really suggest that the next meeting we have, that you folks, if you're to the point of having draft recommendations, that you phrase them, rephrase them, make them calls to action. You don't have to use the D word, demand, but this is what the community expects of you, and this is what the community deserves. We deserve something other than a report, no matter how nice a report it might be. But bring your recommendations, your calls to action to the next meeting and distribute them to the community. Give us the drafts that we know what the heck you folks are talking about, okay? That's communication, that's transparency, that's accountability. So I thank you for everything you've done so far, and I'm really encouraged by this. I'm incited by this, another I word, but I hope you are too, and that you can move forward. Implementation is key, and that's all I have to say. I used all 5. Thank you.
Next speaker is Vinoy Gupta.
My comments don't relate to commission directly, but I was so moved that I had to make these comments. One of the commissioners, she said she had nightmares, and she had tears in her eyes, and I was moved by that. And all the great human beings in the world had these experiences. Martin Luther Jr., his house was bombed, and he had such bad experience in nightmares that he prayed to Jesus. He was assassinated. Gandhi was kind of lynched in 1896, and he was almost beaten to unconsciousness in 1908, and he was assassinated. And Jesus was crucified. Socrates was given poison, and Oscar Romero was assassinated. So I want the commissioner not to get discouraged, and I felt sad that she had tears in her eyes. one should never discourage, and it's the right cause, and one should keep on working on that cause. Thank you.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Ken Pasha.
Evening, everybody. I do want to give a special thanks to the people that came to join us tonight. You made a short journey to give us a really long, deep, and interesting dive into the kind of things that we really need a lot more information about, because you guys have been where we're at now as a community and have gone a long way from there. And it means a lot to us that you took the time to come and share that with us. So thank you so much. I'm definitely going to sit down and read that report. I'm really excited to dig into that. And I think that's something that I would encourage everybody, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, to do so, because that report really kind of outlines the kind of things that I think as this commission possibly comes to a close, we really need to consider what we're asking from our leaders. The county board does not care. I don't know if you guys have been to one of their meetings, but they don't care. It's 30 minutes. They're in and out. They don't talk about anything that happens in this community. They don't give any shift to what you guys discuss. It's insanely frustrating. They should already be cooking up the next round of funding to keep you guys going, right? But if you ask Van Meter, he thinks your work's done. Does anybody think our work's done?
No.
Anybody think we've prevented what happened to Sonia from happening again?
Not yet.
Really? And I don't ask that as though any of you think that your work is done, or do you know. You guys have been, we've gone through this many months now. But I really want you to consider, when we talk about those recommendations, let's avoid the kind of things that we saw at Southeast a couple weeks ago, that were bland general policy things where they're, oh, we talked to community stakeholders. None of us were invited. I didn't see most of you guys there. And I think that's what's really frustrating, is we tend to take what they give us and accept it because it's better than what we've gotten before. And I think it's time we stop doing that. Because quite frankly, I think the circumstances are more dire than any of us, except for some of the older generation, have been alive for. I mean, we know people that suffered through segregation that are still alive right now. Well, we're headed back openly, right? I mean, they're taking over whole cities with the National Guard, federalizing police forces. I mean, I encourage everyone to consider strongly, when we think about the recommendations, we need to stop asking gently for more. We need to forcefully, not aggressively, but forcefully make them capitulate. It's time we stop asking them gently to consider our humanity and whether or not we deserve justice. We shouldn't have to force a state senator to carry stuff to the finish line when our county board should be responsive. And it's frustrating because you guys know I deal with city as well, and it's like, what we're looking at in the next year is a degradation of what little social safety net we had. LIHEAP's gonna be gone, SNAP's gonna be greatly reduced. I mean, Medicare, Title II funds are already gone for the district. I mean, we're gonna be running into the kind of things that are unprecedented. And when we think about those recommendations, I think one of them would be either that you guys continue your mission, or that you pressure community groups into actually funding and standing up for the work that you're doing, because we're far from done. We have a sheriff's race coming up, right? When the commission, if you guys end, you guys will then have the ability to make political moves and statements. And I strongly encourage you to take into account what's happening right now. That sheriff's race will change the face of Sangamon County Sheriff's Department. We can go with the same old white Republicans like Paula Crouch. We can go with, you know, somebody promises change, or we can go with the Democrat. But I encourage everybody to look beyond those labels and consider who we're actually going to be putting in charge of a department that is responsible for many deaths, many murders, in the jail, on the street, and it's going to keep happening because their standards have not changed beyond, well, we're going to look at the hiring records. Well, what about all the people that are still on that force? What about the kind of culture that led to the decision-making that led to Sean Grayson being hired and retained and brought on, even though they knew what he was up to? They were that desperate that they took somebody on with that bad of a record because they can't recruit anybody. And as noted, recruiting's not the issue. It's what we do with them after. It's how we punish them, it's how we treat them, and it's the same problem with SPD. And I think it's something that the report that they put together is really powerful because it also cuts into like, are the youth okay in our community? No, they are not. They're definitely not okay. They're involved in gang wars. They're killing themselves in schools. I mean, we're facing an endemic problem here that is not unique to our situation, but unfortunately our leaders act like it. And I really strongly encourage, I know a lot of people think I'm too aggressive and that I pursue my goals too loudly or that I should be nicer to people, but I've had a boot on my neck since I was a child. And I refuse to be quiet about it. I refuse to quietly be nice and make everybody comfortable with the way I feel about things. And I strongly encourage this commission to do that publicly when you drop that report. Because another general report that lets them go, well, we did that. Oh, well, we're considering that. That's bullshit. Pardon my language, but I'm tired of it. I'm tired of them acting like they're doing what we asked, and all they're really doing is giving us just another inch. That's it. And they're like, be happy with that inch. Be happy we didn't go back 2. And it's bullshit. Like, I'm just tired of waiting for them to, like, hear the better reason, because I'm just going to share this, and it's hard for me because I don't want to be overly negative in a time where we need positivity, but, like, bro, they're never going to fucking listen to us. They're not. Do you think they don't know? You think they don't know what's wrong around here? When they go in those back rooms and they make those jokes with each other, or they make little snide comments during county board meetings or during city council, or they cut the sound off, or they go, well, we don't actually have to live broadcast this stuff. I mean, that's the kind of thing where, like, and then nothing happens. People go, well, you know, maybe we'll get to it next time, or maybe, you know, we should say something about it. But, like, how many months in are we, man? Look at this. Does that make anybody else disheartened? It's fucking killing me, man, because I know you guys care. I don't think anyone on this commission has spent all these months showing up here because you don't care. I know every one of you outside of here does community work, does networking, tries to share resources, and where does it get us, man? These fuckers just ignore us. They're, well, we'll take it under consideration. And I don't know, man, I'm just disheartened because the community feels the same way, and it's almost like they think none's really gonna change. And I strongly encourage you guys, when you make those recommendations, make it with the idea that this is it. I mean it. Like, they're snatching people off the streets, and they've moved on in the poem at this point. We're past the you know, the marginalized, and they're moving on to, like, nurses at hospitals that upset them. Officials. What do you think's gonna happen to all those people in D.C.? Anybody know what the Night of Long Knives is? What do you think happens when they take over, federalize the police force and start deploying National Guards? I got friends in LA. It's not pretty. What's actually happening there is not happening on the news. So I want you to really think about that when you make your recommendation. This is not a normal time. This is not 10 years ago. This is not even 20 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, it really is getting to that point. So maybe make some recommendations that are some real fuck yous. And I again, pardon my language, but, like, punch them in the mouth. Make them bleed a little. Embarrass them. Make them feel like we have to feel all the goddamn time, like they're gonna have to work harder to get something done. Because we're not gonna keep cooperating with them and capitulating and backing up a step so they feel more comfortable, or letting them tone police us into complacency. Because again, I know people think I'm too harsh sometimes, but, like, that boot has never come off my neck. Doesn't matter how many protests I've had, how hard I've fought, how many changes have been passed, how many legislation, because they push harder every time. And it might not be my neck next time, it'll be somebody else's I love or care about. And I guess I'm just tired of waiting for somebody to come running up and just shove them off and put their boot on their neck. I don't know. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for all the public comment. This completes our evening. We thank you for coming here tonight, gathering with us, and online. Our next full commission meeting is scheduled for Monday, September 15th at the Salvation Army at 6 p.m. Please stay tuned to the website, masseycommission.com, as well for more information about this meeting and work group sessions that will be scheduled. I'm looking for a motion to adjourn. Oh, yes. Yes, we talked about that at the beginning of the meeting, or beginning before our meeting, so, yes, yes.
Motion.
Okay, Susan, Bree? All right, all in favor, say aye. 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 The motion is approved, the meeting is adjourned.